the 2024 Patent Thought Symposium, and this year on AI, the subjects that we're all talking about and all thinking about, and perhaps fearing too, because who knows what's going to happen? Who knows where we're going? And who knows, with the doubling of AI capability every 2 months now, much faster than Moore's law predicted, we're heading somewhere we don't know yet, but we're going to find out. The people who are actually here are the cream of society. The extra level of flavor is just underneath the surface online, and then the rest of the world will be able to catch up with the online publication later on, because we're all going to have to think about this. Peter Robinson's been thinking about this sort of thing for longer than most of us. He started off, of course, at the best place in Cambridge, and starting off in a place that all of us at Cambridge despised, the computer lab, because the computer lab demanded that we sign up and demanded that we find out where they are down a deep corridor with a dark cave-like structure that's the only place the university would let them play in. And now the computer department has grown into, oh, well, bigger than the university, really, if we admit it, but not physically. Peter took his skills off to Adelaide and off to British Columbia, and very sensibly came back to Cambridge, and has now for many years been showing that the computers are not just machines to organize email lists, but they can actually think, and perhaps think better than us, but at the moment they're just thinking the same as us, as long as we've already thought it in the past. So I'm really looking forward to what you're going to say about emotions, because, hey, we know machines don't have emotions, but maybe you're going to tell us differently. So Peter, it's really great to have you here. I say for the record, Peter Robinson, so you look it up, and or us.
Thank you very much. Good. Are you seeing my screen on your transmission? Excellent. Hello, I'm Peter Robinson from the University of Cambridge. I'm a computer scientist, and I'm going to be talking about emotions. And emotions aren't something you normally expect computer scientists to talk about. You know, the extrovert computer scientist is the one who looks at your feet rather than his own when he's talking to you. So why do emotions matter to computer scientists? That I will mention to start with. And then imago Dei, which is this rather pretentious Latin phrase, we still do speak Latin in Cambridge, for the image of God. And well, actually not that many computer scientists are concerned about what they mean by the image of God. So I'm going to talk about that as well. So just to talk about why I'm interested in emotions. My research work has been about trying to improve the way that people interact with machines. And one way that we can improve that is by understanding better how people communicate with each other. And when people talk to each other, they don't just process the words that are being said, but it matters how they're being said. So there are various things that play a part in this. One is facial expressions. When I speak to you, I look at your faces and I can see whether you're interested or bored, confused or understanding. And if you're lucky, I change the way I'm talking to respond to that. It's something that psychologists call mind reading. Doesn't mean looking at you and knowing what you had for breakfast, but it's just trying to understand what you're thinking, your mental state, while I'm talking to you. And it's a natural part of everyday human communication. And people who can't do it are at a social disadvantage. It's people with autism spectrum conditions. Well, computers tend to ignore these. So in that sense, computers are autistic. And we've been trying to see if we can do something about it. So that's where I come into it. What about the image of God? Well, let's lay down the groundwork for that first. And the image of God is Make this work. Yes, better. We need to go back to the one of Genesis is the best place to find what we mean by the image of God, because there we're told that God made mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created. And that's in, whichever it is, verse 27 of Genesis. So if we're in the image of God, well, we need to look back at the previous 26 verses of Genesis to see what God's like. And what we've seen there is that God's creative, making the universe and all that's in it. He judged what he had made. At the end of each day, he said it was good. So God was ruling over it. And actually, a little bit later, we discover that God's interested in relationships. He wanted the man that he'd created to have a relationship with him and to have a relationship with his companion, the woman Eve. So these are the three characteristics of the image of God, that God's creative, that he rules, judges, and that he made us to have relationships. And those are things that matter to people. And actually, of course, the rule that had been delegated to them, they assumed it to themselves. They broke the relationship that they had with God. And a few chapters later, they were breaking relationships between people. So, with that background, let's go back to talking about emotions. Why do emotions matter? Well, I've said it's part of everyday communication, and this is something that's been studied by scientists for many years. A great Cambridge scientist, Charles Darwin, in the 19th century, was interested in this phenomenon that our faces convey something about our mental states in a way that's universal. And he was interested in this because he thought that if there was a universal language of expression in the face, it would give humans an evolutionary advantage. And so he studied this, and about 7 years after his book on the origin of species, he published a book called The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, in which he explored this language in the face. And it's an interesting book for a scientific textbook. It sold out in 2 weeks when it was published in 1872. And it was also one of the first scientific works to include photographs. And here you see a plate from the book. The pictures on the left-hand side are ones that have been taken by one of a couple of Darwin's colleagues in the UK, but the ones on the right are particularly interesting. They were taken by a French scientist, Guillaume Duchenne de Boulogne, working in Paris, who had taken these pictures. He took a lot of pictures of this particular tramp off the streets of Paris. And what you see here are his neutral expression. He hadn't got many teeth. He'd been told a joke, so he was laughing, and it had electrodes attached to his face to activate the muscles that would make him look as if he was smiling. I'm not quite sure why Duchenne was interested in that, but he was interested in seeing that you couldn't artificially smile. Actually, if you try and look as if you're amused, there are certain features of the face that will be disguised, particularly some muscles up by the eye. And Duchenne was interested in that. Well, Duchenne had taken lots of photographs of this man in various emotional states. And these were full plate photographs, sort of A4 paper size. And Darwin had a set of them, and Darwin used these for what we'd now call a crowdsourcing experiment to see if they were universally understood. Now, we actually have Darwin's set of photographs in the University Library in Cambridge. Here are some scans of some of them. There's about 50 in the whole collection. And what Darwin used to do in his crowdsourcing experiment, it wasn't quite like the way we do crowdsourcing now. He would invite people round for dinner at his country house, and over drinks before dinner, he'd pass around the photographs and ask people what emotions they perceived. And he put the answers into a spreadsheet. Now, of course, this was a while before we had electronic computers, so the spreadsheets were big sheets of paper, and we have those in the university library as well. And what you see there is a row for each of the pictures he was handing around and a column for each of the people, and he's written in the emotion that people perceived, the different people perceived in the different pictures. Well, we repeated this experiment a few years ago using modern crowdsourcing techniques on the internet. So we took the Darwin pictures, scanned 10 of them in, and did an experiment. We got about 20,000 people to say what emotions they perceived. And those are the labels under the pictures on this slide. The top row are the consensus view that Darwin observed. The bottom row is the consensus view that we observed 130 years later. And the interesting thing is, firstly, there is a consensus view, and secondly, actually, it's pretty well the same. We haven't changed our interpretation of facial expressions. The language has changed a bit, as language does, but there is something universal about these. Well, actually, that's not a very good scientific experiment. Darwin's test on a few dozen people doesn't really prove anything. And Darwin fell out of favor early in the 20th century. And it was really only when an American psychologist, Paul Ekman, revisited his work in the 1960s and picked up the ideas from Darwin's work and identified, out of the actually 7 or so emotions that Darwin had considered, 6 that Ekman considered to be basic emotions, ones that are important for survival, so they're of evolutionary importance. And here they are: anger, disgust, fear, joy, sadness, and surprise. And using modern photographs, Ekman could actually do much larger samples and indeed post the photographs off around the world, and discovered that there was still a fairly universal interpretation, at least of these 6 basic emotions. But it was cross-cultural as well as universal within an individual culture. Actually, we sort of know that, and we know that from Hollywood. I don't know if you've seen the Pixar film Inside Out that came out a few years ago. In it, it's a cartoon film, and it shows the characters, but primarily a young girl, whose emotions are seen as individual characters battling inside her head to take control of her feelings. And so you see here anger, disgust, joy, surprise, and sadness. Sorry, fear and sadness. Actually, there's no surprise there. It's the one that Disney omitted. You don't get surprises in Disney films. But actually, this goes back a lot further in Hollywood. So these pictures are of a Hollywood star called Florence Lawrence. And in the early part of the 20th century, 1909, she was making 3 feature films a week. 3 films a week. Now, that's a level of productivity you don't see in Hollywood nowadays. Of course, the reasons were, well, the films were only 20 minutes long, because that's as long as a roll of film could manage. And the films were silent, so she didn't have to learn her lines. Actually, the director sitting off camera could be telling her what to do. But the fact that the films were silent meant her emotional expression was terribly important. And the pictures show you, this is her sort of advertising card, the huge range of emotions that she could present through her face. There's an amusing twist here, which we'll return to later. The picture at the top left has a caption piety, and the one bottom right has the caption sadness. And I can't tell them apart. And I think this maybe says something of the morals of Hollywood starlets, even in 1909. Well, maybe, but actually what it says is piety and sadness are slightly subtler emotions than the basic emotions that Ekman studied. And it just leads us to realize there are other mental states that we might want to be able to detect. You don't really get angry with your computer, you get frustrated with it. It's a different sort of mental state. And my colleague Simon Baron-Cohen in the Autism Research Centre, Professor Sir Simon Baron-Cohen, developed a much richer taxonomy, not just the 6 basic emotions, the sort of visceral ones that are important for survival, but he took a dictionary and picked out all the 1,200 or so emotions and identified about 400 very finely graduated different mental states, and then grouped those into 24 higher level categories. And those higher level categories include the 6 basic emotions, but also a further 18 what are called complex mental states or cognitive mental states. They reflect what you're thinking. So those are the things like understanding, confused, that actually matter for interactions with computers. Well, he also did some work. He was interested in intervention for children with high functioning autism. And one of the tools that he developed for that was to put together a DVD with lots of video clips of actors acting out all of these different mental states so that children could look at them and learn how to recognize them. And for various reasons, that turned out not to be very effective as an intervention for children with autism. And there are further work that he's done that's explored why that is and how to address it. But never mind, that DVD with this 6 samples of each of 400 mental states, 2,500 video clips, is ideal for machine learning. And so I had a very bright research student called Ron Al-Kaloubi who put together a system which allowed you to point a camera at someone's face and track the facial movements. If you look very carefully, you'll see blue dots on the person's face. They aren't actually painted on, this is diagnostics from the computer. From those, we can infer which muscles are being used. And from those, we can infer various gestures. So you might have there's a language actually that Paul Ekman designed for describing actions in the face. So head up, head down, are 2 of them, but a sequence of them is nodding. And the bars at the top left are actually showing you those gestures. And then across the bottom, we're getting inferences of the mental states. And this was somebody at a conference who was being asked to act as if she was agreeing, and red is the agreeing trace. And what we'll see, and I'll play the video again, is that she has been asked to act agreeing. It takes a little time to get going, but then we see that she is nodding and smiling, which is signaling agreement. And then she stops and she wants to know whether it's worked. So we see a burst of green, she's interested, burst of blue, concentrating because she's asked to do some more acting, and a bit more agreeing. Well, that's of course a carefully chosen example, but we did more scientific tests of this, and it turns out this is actually more accurate than about 90% of the population at recognizing some of these conditions in people. So that was actually quite an interesting piece of work, and it's one of the few bits of work that actually considers these complex mental states rather than just, there's been a lot of work done on basic emotions. You can typically recognize those from a still photograph, but this requires a few seconds of movie analysis, and that's a more complicated computing problem. Well, there are other ways you could classify emotions. A Canadian psychologist called Jim Russell got a group of people in 1980 or thereabouts to take some of these emotion words and scatter them around a table, putting ones that were sort of similar together and ones that were different far apart. And as they did this, he saw that they developed, as it were, axes. And there's an axis that's running from left to right across this, which is going from negative emotions to positive emotions. So from depressed and gloomy across to happy and content. And that's something that psychologists call valence, negative to positive. And there's a vertical axis as well, which is to do with how animated you are. arousal. It goes from very passive at the bottom, sleepy, to very active at the top, excited. And of course, you can be active and positive valence, so that's something like excited, or you can be active and negative valence, that's something like alarm, and so on. So this actually gives you a two-dimensional diagram that you can then scatter these emotion words around. And that appeals to computer scientists because it means you've got exact coordinates for each emotion. Well, actually, that turns out to be completely wrong. Each of them covers a whole compass of area. It's a really quite difficult thing to work with. But never mind, it was interesting to try and analyse. And it turns out these two axes cover about 50% of the variance that you see in the way people respond to this. And then there are other axes sort of going in and out of the page into some fourth dimension that cover things like potency. Is it a weak or strong emotion? Its tendency, is it inward or outward expression, and so on. It ends up, you need so many dimensions, it's not actually terribly useful, but that didn't stop us building a new system. Here we have a new face tracker. Another one of my graduate students had a spaltricitis who actually wrote this face tracker. He now does the same work for Microsoft Research. And you can see again, lots more dots on the face, identifying different parts of it in a box, showing the direction it's looking. We pick the face out, and at the bottom left, you see sort of just the face. So we normalize it so the eyes and mouth are in the same place. There's some strange mathematical analysis, and then the histogram bars are showing us which muscles are activating. And from that, we can make inferences about actual mental states as discrete states. So using the same classification that we used before, in fact, in this case, the basic emotions, and also a trait wandering around this two-dimensional plane. Well, this stuff works, and it works particularly looking at the face to determine valence, whether you're happy or sad, if you like, negative, positive. And in fact, Rana El-Kalyoubi, the person who wrote the first system, went on to set up a company in Boston, Massachusetts, which markets a system that does exactly that. And they found it very useful. Well, they've sold it. Initially, their market was companies testing prototype television commercials. It's very expensive to make a television commercial, even more expensive to broadcast it. And so they're very keen to see if it's going to work. And so they show them to a small audience, and typically they get an audience of 20 or so people, show them the commercial while filming the audience, and then a load of psychologists sit down and look at each of the people and see how they reacted at different points. Well, Rana's system allows them to point a camera at the audience and monitor them all actually as they're being watched the commercial. So you can see how their pleasure varies with the point in the commercial that you've reached, and that helps you judge the commercial. And that turns out you can actually use the same system to measure people's changing political opinions during a political debate. And it's surprisingly good at seeing how effective speakers are at persuading an audience of something. But the real market for this has arisen since. As we get cars that are more and more automated, it's important that the car is aware of the driver. If you've got a modern car with lots of technology in it, and you're driving in an unfamiliar city centre, you're lost, there's lots of traffic, you're late for a meeting, the last thing you want is the car telling you to change the oil in 1,000 miles time. That's just a distraction. What you want it to do is to see that you're confused and concentrating, and it should remove distractions. So it should stop your mobile phone from ringing. It might even turn the radio off. It might even let you drive in the wrong direction for a bit until you recover your composure and then bring you back in. But also, if you've got a car that's semi-automatic, so it drives automatically on motorways, as most modern cars do, you need to make sure that the driver is awake when they have to take over control to drive off the motorway where the automation isn't so good. And so this is actually becoming mandatory in modern cars, that they monitor the drivers and check that they're paying attention, they're not falling asleep as well for that. And that's a very big market. But we also use this system for more work with the Autism Research Centre and a massive European project where we were the next step in Simon Baron-Cohen's investigations of interventions for children with autism was, well, we actually learn about things by doing them. So why not get the children with high-functioning autism, with Asperger's, to act out emotions and then monitor them and monitor actually their facial expression, but also their voice, the tone of voice, not what they're saying, but how they're saying it. So pitch, energy, tempo, and also their body posture and gesture. We say a lot through that. These are all things that we've analysed, but we have colleagues in Europe who are analysing those. And together with a games company that put together a load of games where children explore emotions, but then as part of this have to act them out. And this was the component that we did. It looks a bit like this. You see here the girl in the yellow t-shirt is an actor acting an emotion. Person top right is another one of my research students, Andrew Adam, who was building this system, and she is trying to emulate the actor. And what she sees are little histograms that show her which of the muscle movements in her face are not matching the actor. And that's a way of giving her feedback to help her improve her acting of the emotion, which will have the side effect of teaching her to recognize the emotion. And that actually turned out to be more successful. Well, I could talk at length, very great length, I'm afraid, about, we've been doing this for about 20 years. I've had at least 24 research students and graduate students doing different aspects of this problem. And we have looked at things like analysing speech, analysing body posture and gesture. But also, and I want to spend a little time talking about this, looking at how you can synthesize these emotions. So this brings us to the synthetic emotions of the title. It's good for a computer system to understand what you're thinking. If you're frustrated or confused, you can imagine that a teaching system might want to know that you're confused, so it could slow down, or know if you're bored, so it could speed up. An online shopping system might like to know that you're interested, so it will show you more of the same sort of product. But why doesn't the computer express emotions back? So we thought we'd look at that as well. And there are different ways you can do this. One is with cartoons. So you see two pictures on the left, again, cartoon films where robotic characters actually have emotional characteristics displayed through very limited channels. So typically just through the eyes. And it's interesting, in the face, the eyes convey about half the emotion, and that's actually very effective at conveying emotion from, you could imagine, an animated avatar on your computer screen to you. And then some people think, well, if we have robotic systems helping us, you could think of paramedics coming to, it would be nice if it had a sort of humanish presence. And so someone suggested that you might like a robotic doctor like this one in the middle, which is roughly speaking a Segway with a television set balanced on it. Now, frankly, if I'd had a heart attack, I think the last thing I'd want is a machine with a television set balanced on its head coming to talk to me. But some people thought this might be the answer. But we wanted to explore this a bit more carefully. And in fact, another of my research students, Laurel Rick, she's the taller one in the picture on the right, was interested in actually trying to work with robots that have emotional expression. But we did do some work on cartoons, and so here you see some experiment where we are using our face tracker to track movements in my face and then play them back onto a cartoon avatar. So you can see that we can actually copy my actions onto the cartoon avatar and incidentally onto animate still pictures of other people. It turns out that it doesn't really add much to the communication, but the robots sounded like more fun, so we thought we'd have a go at that. So Laurel got one of these now robots, and these are really quite extraordinary things. They're very widely used, actually, with children. They're about 1/2 meter tall. As you can see, it's made of plastic. It doesn't look terribly human, but people empathize with them in an extraordinary way. And it has a couple of dozen motors within it that allow it to do these various actions, like sitting down and standing up, and it's got so on. And they're very popular, although I have to say I'm not quite sure why, because one thing they can't do is express emotions through their faces. The facial expressions on this, it's rigid plastic. It has 2 LEDs for the light, for its eyes, that's it. So that doesn't look really as if it's going to be very useful for emotional interaction. So Laurel thought, well, she found this cheap toy. It's a sort of glorified karaoke kit, or virtual, which is a monkey. And when you sing into your karaoke microphone, it makes the face move a bit. And she wondered whether people would react to this. So she ripped it apart and put new controllers, kept the same motors, but controlled them separately, and then ran an experiment where people came and had a conversation with this robot. And the robot either emulated the facial expressions that the people were making, and that's a way that we acknowledge somebody when we're having a conversation, or it made random movements. And when it was copying back movements to people, they perceived it as paying more attention to them. Patently, it wasn't human, it wasn't alive, it wasn't sentient, and yet they thought that it was paying attention. And that's interesting. It means that there really is something in this emotional expression by machines. So we thought that would be worth looking into in a bit more detail. And we commissioned from a man called David Hanson in America, a robotic head, which has over 30 servos that replicate the muscles in the human face. And David Hanson makes these sort of robots for the Disney Corporation for their theme parks. They're ferociously expensive. I think we spent about $50,000 on this thing. But actually, Andrew, again, working with it, we dressed it up. The face, by the way, is meant to look like Charles Babbage, the great computer pioneer in Cambridge. And you can see the really quite extraordinary range of expressions we can put on the face. David Hanson, there are a lot of motors in there. He's very good at prosthetics. And when we dress it up with a shirt and a wig, it begins to look a bit like a real person. And indeed, if it was sitting on the desk in my office, people walking by in the corridor would do a double take and come back to look and see whose head it was I had on my desk. So this looked quite promising, except when we tried to do experiments with it, what we wanted to do, we thought this is a really realistic robot. Let me give you a little bit of audio. One of my students took a video of a famous opera singer singing an aria, fed that into our face tracker, and then animated the robot to do the same thing. So actually what the robot is doing here is singing an aria. And what you see is, it's weird. It simply doesn't work. The still photographs are extraordinary, but as soon as it moves, you know there's something wrong. And it turns out that people we tried really very hard to control these servers, and we just could not get it to be realistic. People are very good at detecting anomalous movements in the face. It's a way that you tell that somebody's ill, and so you need to be aware of that. And what we thought we could do was have people having conversations with this robot, and then we'd turn down the realism and see how realistic it had to be. Well, the answer was it never got close enough for it to be convincing. People just thought it was creepy, actually. So that was a very expensive mistake. And you learn a lot from mistakes. It's always good to make them, but that was quite a big one. Well, actually, I say that. There was one use that we found for this, which was training medical students. Now, there is a medical condition called dystonia, which results in random movements of the face. And it's really disconcerting when you meet a person with dystonia, because they're particularly random movements in the face, but actually the rest of their body as well. And because we're good at recognizing or seeing anomalous movements and identifying it as a sign of sickness, we get nervous about that. And when medical students first encounter a patient with dystonia, they're quite likely to have a look of disgust on their face. It's just a natural human reaction. And it's not a good idea for doctors, even trainees, to look disgusted when they meet a patient. So we thought, oh yes, our robot is good at random facial movements, unconvincing as they may be. And so we got a with dystonia, fabulous guy, came in and let us film him. And then we replayed his actions on the robot. And we took two groups of medical students, one of whom came and had a conversation with our robot while it was making these random movements, and one of the other group didn't. And then they met real patients with dystonia, and the ones who had been habituated by interacting with our robot could control themselves much better than the ones who hadn't. So that was verging on a success. Except it turns out we had a third group who just watched the movies of the patient with dystonia, and they were habituated just as well. So the robot was actually irrelevant. So, as I say, really expensive mistake, except it turns out if you have a robotic head that looks even vaguely humanoid and moves, the press will beat a path to your door. So the one thing this robot turned out to be really good for was publicity and training my research students and graduate students to do television interviews. And I guess the highlight of this, when we were invited to appear on a chat show on Spanish television. So you see here me and my research student Ian Davis. We went over to Madrid for a couple of days. This is a show that goes out live 4 days a week in Spain for about 40 minutes. It's sort of the equivalent of a Graham Norton show. And they actually have a science spot for 5 minutes in the middle of each show. And they were running short of ideas, so they invited us over. And what we'd done, we just had the robot copying what I was doing, and you can see its movements there. They're weird, they're creepy, and the audience thought, amazing, it's perfect. Incidentally, my team said, we said we're going to go and do this live television show. They said, you're going to take an experimental face tracker and an unreliable robot on live television. What could possibly go wrong? And I said, Spain, nobody will know. Now, actually, it was a success insofar as you can consider that a success. This one's the host of the show, incidentally, the equivalent of the Graham Norton character. And in 2-3 minutes rehearsal in the afternoon, he worked out what would look convincing. So slow, exaggerated movements would actually look good. And so when he took over, it copied him, and everybody thought it was absolutely amazing. It was a terrific success, which is why I've kept the video. But the fact is that the robot's useless. But it does mean that I then started getting called up because I was deemed to be an expert on robots, which I'm not really. I mean, somebody else built it for us. We were interested in the human interactions with the robot. But I'd get these calls, not infrequently. This was 5 or 10 years ago, when there was some press coverage of some new robotic advance. And I'd get phoned up and says, is it true that robots are going to become sentient and take over the world? And I'd say, well, no, pull the plug out. But it made me start thinking about why we think that about robots. And if you look at the press headlines, there are a lot of press headlines. These were some years ago, even more now, especially in the wake of the generative language models like ChatGPT, that people are getting concerned about what they call AI, and what AI is a nice question. And there's this interesting confusion in the human mind. We think of robots as being humanoid, looking like people, becoming sentient, becoming malicious, and turning on us. Probably says something more about us as fallen people, that we see them in our image as, well, humanoid, sentient-ish, malicious people. And we're actually imprinting on the robots what we actually understand our own characters to be. And there's a lot of press about this. And the views range from some people who say, well, the next step of evolution is just that we're going to evolve into machines. And there's something of the transhumanism debate lurking in there. And you see a lot of, actually, if you look at a lot of these really weird beliefs that some people are developing, a lot of them just come because there's a God-shaped hole in their lives, and they fill it with any sort of rubbish, including the fact, well, the assertion that we're going to evolve into machines. But why are we interested in robots? And this is actually quite an interesting question. It goes back a long way. I'm rather fond of this thing. You may have seen it. It was in the Science Museum a couple of years ago. Normally it lives in the Smithsonian. And it's a clockwork monk made in the 16th century. It stands about so tall. And it moves along the grounds. It looks left and right, raises its hand, has a rosary in one hand, and it bows its head when the rosary comes up. And people thought, yes, good, we've automated worship in some sense. Well, it wasn't a horrific mistake, but never mind. But people wanted to do this, and it goes back a lot longer. 6 centuries BC, the Buddha Shakyamuni had this idea of precious metal people that worshipped, and that's carried on in various sorts of Buddhist beliefs that they can have machines that do things. And of course, it's a regular staple of fiction. So from the Jewish golem mythologies through again in the 16th century, through to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in the 19th century, to actually one of the more interesting works is a play called Rossum's Universal Robots by the Czech author Karel Čapek, which was published in 1921. It's an interesting play for several reasons. It was the first literary work to popularize the use of the word robot to mean a humanoid automaton. Before that, robot had been a rather specific automatic traffic policeman in central Prague. So actually a thing that looked a bit like railway signals that controlled the traffic, and that was a robot policeman. But Rossum had the idea we'd have robot servants, and as is the way in fiction, they became sentient, they turned on their human owners. And actually the play is a really very interesting examination of what it means to be human, which is really what Čapek was exploring. And of course, there's been a lot of fiction with robots since then. Well, actually, about the same time, the film Metropolis came out, where the inventor Rottwang invents this robotic robot to impersonate a revolutionary leader, to mislead the crowds. There's all the iRobot series by Asimov, and perhaps particularly Arthur Clarke, or more particularly Stanley Kubrick's HAL in the film 2001, which is interesting in a number of ways. I mean, firstly, it's one of the few stories with robots where the robot doesn't look like a person, just look like a television camera, this red light in the spaceship, for those of you who remember the film. And it's also interesting because it does turn on the crew of the spaceship and try to eliminate them. But actually, if you think about the story, it is just doing what it was programmed to do, that is to preserve the mission at all costs. So some of this fiction is quite interesting, some of it is a bit superficial. I mean, I think actually, if you read Katsuo Ishiguro's Clara and the Sun, that came out a few years ago, that's actually one of the more intelligent assessments of what it might mean to have a humanoid robot with feelings. I think it's rather a beautiful book. Or if you're fans of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Douglas Adams's Robots Are Your Plastic Pal Who's Fun to Be With, into that sort of thing. But there's a more general question, really. What are we thinking of when we conceive of machines in the image of man? Why do we get so excited about them? They're not actually a particularly good image. The physical representation is poor. As I think I've demonstrated, our robotic head is one of the best around, and it's rubbish. There's no relationship, it's just a machine. Don't have a relationship with the machine. And although we can have computer systems that recognize emotions, even that display them, that's not the same as having empathy. Being able to recognize emotions and display them but have no feelings is actually the mark of a psychopath. And possibly the computers we've got are psychopaths, but it's more to do with what we're doing with the information in between. And of course, there's absolutely no spiritual dimension in the machine. So a lot of the things that are being said about machines sound very plausible, but give it a moment's thought, it's rubbish. So what's going on here? Well, on one aspect, there's sort of following on from the Enlightenment. We think science can explain everything. And so in the 19th century, people were seen to be steam engines, essentially, and we thought of our way our body works as steam engines. In the 20th century, the age of computers, we think of our minds as computers. And we're just trying to explain everything in terms of machines. We're sort of taking humanity, which is subtle and complex, and just reducing it to the level of a machine. Or, on the other hand, we endow machines with human characteristics. So even that little narrow robot, you have one of those in a room, people will go in and they'll coo over it because, well, it looks like a baby, actually. And people empathize with babies. It doesn't look much like a baby, but they want to think of it as being human. And this is actually all a big mistake. It's a bit of a distraction, really, because there are machines that should be worrying us, but it's not ones that look like humans. And Vint Cerf, who is a very distinguished computer scientist, sort of the man who invented the internet, or one of the pioneers of the internet, made this really interesting observation that anything, any system that monitors the world around it, takes input from the world around it, and produces output that has some perceptible effect on the world, is effectively a robot. And so that means a lot of the robots are actually hidden. They're unseen, but they're embedded in the world around us. They don't look like people. So the obvious things are things like the software controlling our cars, particularly, dare I say it, self-driving autonomous cars, which we don't really know what's going on in there. The same extends to fly-by-wire aeroplanes. The whole 737 MAX debacle comes down to, well, actually bad computer science. Well, actually bad aeronautic engineering as well, but anyway. And also things like automatic trading systems running the big markets in the city. They were substantially responsible for, if not causing, at least amplifying the 2008 financial crisis. And these are things that don't look like humans. They're just computer software operating in the world around us. And there are even more obvious versions of this. So we've seen this particularly with the growth of social media. So all of these systems like Facebook, YouTube, WhatsApp, Instagram, WeChat, TikTok, all of them exist to show you advertising. They make their money by getting you to watch advertising. And to do that, they need to make sure you use it for more and more time each day. So they monitor what you watch and what you watch more of, and they queue up similar videos because that will keep you online longer. They can show you more advertisements. And they'll also harvest your address book so that they know who your friends are, because they're likely to be like-minded, and draw them in. And the whole of the social media market is driven by advertising, engagement, and growth. And it's not there as for a social good, it's there to make money for its proprietors. And this is having, as we're seeing, very dramatic damaging effects. But that's a robotic system, and the damaging effects are that we get into these echo chambers. We keep on getting shown material that agrees with our preconceptions, and we don't get challenged at all. Well, what do we think? Is this an existential threat? Well, do I think robots are an existential threat? No. Do I think social media an existential threat? Well, yes, quite possibly. Although actually there are others who think that the real danger here is you get bored to death listening to people like me talking about it. But so it's worth just pausing and thinking a bit about what we mean by artificial intelligence. It means different things depending on the context. So often nowadays, it's just an advertising term. This vacuum cleaner has artificial intelligence. It must be better. It's used for scaremongering. The machines are out to get us. They're artificial intelligence. They're becoming sentient. Increasingly, it's used to describe any computer system. So people will talk about AI did this when they just mean the computer program did it, when there's no artificial intelligence involved. And possibly in computer science, we have a slightly more technical view of it. We use artificial intelligence to describe something that we don't know how to do. Once we do know how to do it, we give it a real name, like facial expression analysis or automatic language translation, protein folding, or fraud detection for credit cards. So AI is a very nebulous term. One should actually be very careful about using it. The European Parliament is doing a lot of work on this. They're possibly the leaders worldwide in thinking about regulation and of AI and of these sort of computer systems, particularly sorts of embedded systems that Wim Cerf was worried about. And they have a suitable definition. Technically, we usually mean, and this is where it's taken off recently, the idea of something to do using machine learning. In other words, we gather a huge amount of real world data, which we can gather through people's interactions with the internet increasingly nowadays, and then mathematically fit a statistical model to it, which is enormously complicated. And I talked about 3 or 4 dimensional models earlier. These are models with millions of dimensions, and so huge amounts of data. And then you can use that model to predict how something, given a particular set of conditions, how it will progress. And that's actually all that we see in these generative language systems. They know the sort of patterns of text through analyzing. I reckon that actually the early ChatGPT was trained on something like a volume of literature equivalent to about half of the university library in Cambridge. So it read about half the books in the university library in Cambridge, built a statistical model, very expensive computation. It costs about $5 million to train the model. But once you've got it, you can make predictions. You feed some text in and it'll say, well, probably the next thing to happen will be this and this and this. And that's how it writes the text. And the result, of course, is something that looks very plausible as text, but has absolutely no understanding of meaning. And this is the sort of area that we're now moving into. So and this training data is terribly important. If we go back to things like the self-driving cars, if they're being trained on data from some parts of the United States, they won't know about cyclists or children or things like that. And that, of course, gives problems that we then see. So these things aren't sentient. They give a very good simulation, but they're not the real thing. And actually, the pundits who are trying to sell their books have now moved on to the idea of artificial general intelligence, which is sort of back where they were. It's sort of when machines are human, because they've realized that artificial intelligence doesn't quite mean that. And I suppose if one's talking about artificial intelligence, one ought to mention Alan Turing. Not, I hasten to add, that he had anything to do with computers, really, not much to do with code breaking, but that's another story. He did publish this article in about 1950 about, can a machine think? And it's you're getting a meeting summary with an AI companion. Well, there you are. And he posed this problem that if you could have a conversation with a machine, and he envisaged it operating over teleprinters, essentially text messages. If you couldn't tell whether it was a machine or a person at the other end, the machine would be deemed to be sentient. And it's interesting, the sorts of problems he thought it might do were things like mathematical arithmetic, which he thought computers would be good at, better than people, playing chess, which he thought machines might be better than people, and then writing poetry, which he thought people might be better at. And it's an interesting reflection of the nature of Turing's own mind and thinking, that he gave no thought to relationships as part of this. If you're talking over text, you've got none of these social cues, these social signals in face, voice, and gesture. And interestingly, when he wrote the essay, he was working at the National Physical Laboratory, and the director there was Charles Darwin, actually grandson of the Darwin I spoke about earlier. And Darwin said, rubbish, don't print it. But it was still printed in a popular journal and has acquired some popularity, mainly because Turing died young in unfortunate circumstances. More thoughtful computer scientists like Edgar Dijkstra, the man who invented the algorithm that by and large runs in your route planner, in your satellite navigation system, said that asking the question, can a machine think, is like asking the question, can a submarine swim? It's a category error. It's just not a sensible question. So, is this an existential threat? Well, actually, yes, it is, but not for any of the reasons that most people have been saying. There was this very wise letter published about a year ago now, signed by hundreds of leaders in the tech industry, including people like Demis Hassabis, who set up the DeepMind company, now part of Google, Sam Altman, the chief executive of OpenAI, the people who wrote ChatGPT, Kevin Scott, chief technology officer at Microsoft. And they see a list of problems with these machine tools, and these are real existential threats. We'll lose our human skills. We will rely on computers to do things. I mean, in the case now, if I can't remember something, that's so easy just to pull out your phone and look it up. You're not exercising your brain. They will have bias baked into them because the training data will be selective, and we're seeing this in the way that they use, for example, for pre-training candidates for jobs. The training data was biased, and so the automatic systems are biased. We're seeing this year about half the world will elect new national governments, and we're seeing massive use of these sort of systems to target misinformation at voters, that panders to their prejudices and will persuade them to vote a particular way. And this is certainly a major problem. They're used for social control. So in China, you have to earn social credit by doing party understanding, and the phone monitors you while you do it. And of course, all your communications are monitored by the state in some countries. And that means you then start censoring yourself. It's not as if the state is censoring you. You do it yourself because you know that the state is watching you. And the whole field of autonomous weapons appeals to the military, but is just completely devoid of any ethical background. And fundamentally, these are all problems where the rule that God has delegated to us is being ignored. We're abusing that authority that's been given to us. And again, returning to fiction, there's been a lot of fiction that's addressed this. So I'm rather taken by the by J.M. Forster, short story written in 1909, I think, called The Machine Stopped. And it envisages a world. In 1909, he envisaged a world where people only communicated through electronic means. They lived in isolated houses, communicated electronically, had an attention span that was no longer than a few minutes. And when the machine stops working, the world stops working. Of course, famously, in George Orwell's 1984, the world is monitored, and so people censor themselves. And also, interestingly, in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, people are flooded with entertainment and become mindless, and they lose the will to actually rebel against the state because they're so taken up with trivia. These are all interesting pointers to what we're seeing happening nowadays with social media. People only, what was the figure I saw the other day, that a third of people aged 20 to 25 won't answer the phone, no matter, even if they know it's coming from somebody they know, they will only respond to text communication. That sort of sounds a bit like the machine stops. We're being monitored, we're certainly seeing that. Our interactions are monitored through mobile phones often. And we're flooded with pointless information. That's what social media does. It makes us mindless. So these are serious problems that have been predicted, and we're actually seeing coming true in surprisingly different ways. Well, all of this is being addressed, as I say, by the European Artificial Intelligence Act, and they have set out a framework. They're not trying to specify exactly the systems, but they're seeing really quite imaginatively looking at the sort of problems that might arise and the sort of precautions that people should be taking to avoid them. And indeed, here in this country, our information commissioner has actually banned the use of the sort of emotional analysis software that I was talking about as a tool in job interviewing. Because it's just not reliable, something that we know, but naive users might think it's giving them more information than it really is. And this also resonates with fiction. If you see Brian Aldiss's book, The Primal Urge, where people voluntarily have monitors fitted to themselves, or James Halperin's The Truth Machine, about a machine that can tell whether you're lying or not. These are very worrying things, and typically they don't work well enough to be trusted. So what is going on here? What is the ethical problem that we've got? And actually, what we're seeing is breakdowns in relationships and rule. It does bring us back to being made in the image of God and how we're living on. Machines sense emotions, they express emotions, but they don't have emotions. There's no relationship there. People are, in the words of the creed, born, not made. Computers are made, people are born. There is a difference. And its rule, we're delegating our responsibility given to us by God to rule over the world and letting machines do it. And dare I say it, it's the professionals in my trade profession that are making the mistakes here. Professionals are well paid because they're well educated and they have ethical codes. And in most areas of professional life, you wouldn't allow yourself to be treated by an unlicensed doctor. You wouldn't have a non-qualified engineer build a large bridge for you. And yet in computing, amateurs can do real computing, and they don't seem to have quite the same grasp that the education requires them to have competence in what they're doing, and the ethics requires them to actually think about their motivation for what they're doing. And if you look at the big disasters, you look at the financial trading system that led to the 2008 financial crash, well, it was actually incompetent. They didn't understand control theory, but also their motivation was pretty poor. They were just out to make money out of other people. We look at the 737 MAX debacle. It was motivation to cut costs, was not an ideal motivation, and the competence, well, it was there, but they just didn't bother to admit that they were cutting corners in the software that they provided. So we've got to be very careful when we delegate authority. I suppose I should say that also the social media, who tend to be extremely competent at extracting money from you, but their motivation is not so good. It's to extract money from you. So bringing this full circle, where does that take us? And it brings us back, I think, to trying to rebuild the relationships. And that brings us back to the cross. That is the way that we rebuild relationships. We're all fallen people. That was in Genesis 3. Work your way through the Bible, and in in John 3:16, we know that Christ came to give his life to rebuild those relationships. And that's actually the thing that's missing from so much of society today. And I have just finished with a note of where one of the great triumphs of technology of my age, and looking around the room, maybe even your ages, was sending men around the moon 50 plus years ago. And it was just an enormous technological achievement. And as the Apollo 8 capsule went around the moon, first one to go to the moon, didn't land, just went around a few times and then came back. And on Christmas Eve in 1968, the crew came round and they took this extraordinary picture, now known as Earthrise, because they saw the Earth coming up over the horizon on the moon. And what did they do in their broadcast when they saw that? They read from Genesis 1. They actually saw this was part of God's creation. So really wonderful that the technology is incredible, but it's neutral. What matters is how we use it. I'll finish on that note. I should perhaps say I've alluded to the fact that actually I do none of this work. It's all done by very bright graduate students and postdoctoral researchers. My job is just to feed them with all the money they need, recruit the best people, and then keep out of their way while they do great things, and then claim the credit, which is what I'm doing now. But thank you very much.
Victoria Institute, right from the start, recorded questions from the floor, and they were even published in the journal. So that makes you very, very important, because you are part of this event and you become part of the permanent event. You very cleverly talked up to the line, but I'm not going to let you get away with that. I will subject you to questions from the floor.
A couple of points really. You said that autonomous vehicles aren't very good at recognising cyclists. As a cyclist, I would say that many human drivers
human drivers are no, and in truth, autonomous cars tend to be safer than ones driven by humans. That is true. So it's a bit of a throwaway remark, but it's an example of how training with deficient data might actually be difficult. So there have been, of course, the accidents with autonomous cars tend to get rather well publicised, but they're also rather fewer of them. They just get more publicity.
The other question I was going to ask, you mentioned some films. You know the film Her, where the guy has a relationship with the
Oh, yes,
operating
yes.
system? I thought that was quite plausible. It's a relationship.
Well, that's an interesting question, isn't it? So, I'm very fond of my mobile phone. I guess my wife might even say I have an improper relationship with it, but it sort of takes precedence at times when it shouldn't. If its screen cracks, well, I'll replace it. If the battery loses capacity, I'll replace it. But ultimately, it hasn't got enough memory for the latest apps, and I'll just chuck it away and get a new one. We don't do that with people. I'm now old enough that I have hearing aids. I imagine in time I might need, my heart will become irregular, so I'll need a pacemaker. But it even start to lose my mind. These things happened to my father, and I didn't throw him away when he was bedbound and not particularly sentient. He was my father, and I loved him. And our relationship with people is quite different from our relationship with machines. So yes, it's an entertaining story, but I don't think it's actually the way you really act, or should really act with machines. And it's perhaps this thing that these are very compelling simulations, and we're prepared to believe them, and we should actually be a bit more discriminating.
Yeah, I think my question kind of follows on really on the question of analogical personhood, really. Do you think, as technology advances, as the simulacra becomes more realistic to us, but that connection, I mean, you use your example of the phone, but the phone is quite distant from us in terms of the sort of the feedback mechanisms that are going potentially could occur with more advances. And as we get closer with those advances to what relationship look like, we can say, yes, sure, there's not going to be a spiritual dimension to that. There's perhaps not even going to be a sentient dimension to that. But could it be analogically in a way that is meaningful for us?
Well, so there are various answers to that. They become realistic because we want them to. And that's the thing I discovered with our robot. People so much wanted to believe that it was working, that they suppressed their disbelief and thought it was amazing. It's just an extraordinary thing. I mean, we go and watch our videos and would quite reasonably be quite embarrassed by what it's doing, and yet people are quite happy to take it. So this will get better and better, and yes, what will happen is people will engage with them more and more. And that's very worrying, because the fact is they are simulations, they're not real people. And we're moving into this world where people are prepared to not interact with humans. They prefer to interact with machines. I think it's something to do with control, something with breakdown of relationships generally lurking in there. And partly it's our fault, because we are giving up our responsibilities. So caring for old people is a really interesting example. There's work being done by some of my colleagues at MIT on soft, cuddly toys for people in care homes, particularly people with dementia. So it's sort of like a simulated cat, but it doesn't get bored with you, and it stays there. If you stroke it, it purrs, and it sort of reacts. And that's great. It keeps people quiet and amused. dreadful. I mean, somewhere there are humans who ought to be caring for that person, and they're not. And actually, this is a terrible indictment of the way that we've allowed our society to move. So the technology may well do that, but that doesn't mean we should let it do that.
There's some, in the early days of ChatGPT 3.5, people were given advice from a medic on their condition and also given advice by the AI on their condition. And the AI was twice as accurate, but more disturbingly, 9 times more empathic.
Yes.
So how will we recognize when that machine is actually making a real relationship with us?
Well, we'll never be making a real relationship with you.
How can we tell?
Oh, I think it might be very difficult to tell, but that's one of the things that the European AI Act is seeking to address, that we shouldn't allow that sort of simulation. Yes, and we need to hold these things in tension.
Is there one more last question, Stephen?
Yes, it's an observation, I guess. But, many thanks for everything you said. I think that we have to keep in mind that when we project certain characteristics onto pet robots, for example, cuddly cats, humans have, as humans, we have anthropomorphic tendencies anyway, don't we? That is, when you have a real live dog, cat in the world, our tendency is to project human emotions, sentiments, and so forth. And with God himself, we tend very often to think in anthropomorphic terms. So that in a way, I suppose you agree that it's good for us to think that what we're doing here is in some respects building on tendencies, natural humans. I don't say that to detract from anything you say. I share your concerns. It's grateful.
No, I think that's exactly right. Yes. So we do anthropomorphize animals. Actually, I could have told you about some of Darwin's work on emotional expression in animals, which isn't quite the same vocabulary as humans, but there is something lurking. And of course, yes, we then try and anthropomorphize them. So pet dogs, pet cats, we endow with human characteristics. Yes, I absolutely agree. We do that. I think it's not wise to do it. And some of these robots, I mean, that now robot, like I say, is, it's in no sense realistic. And yet somehow people think of it as a baby. They warm to it in a way that's really quite alarming. You should stand up and look at what's going on.
Thank you so much for making us think about things that we hadn't thought about and pointing out the ways in which we thought and we shouldn't have done about emotions and machines. And thank you for opening up our eyes and making us more disturbed than when we started. Thank you.